In this lesson, we'll continue our discussion of muscle tissue by focusing on how muscles produce energy for muscular contraction. So we know that the main fuel in our body, very simply, is ATP, which stands for adenosine triphosphate. This is the only energy source that muscles can use to do muscle contraction. Once we start doing muscle contractions, our muscles actually require a lot of ATP, right? Not just a little bit, it has to have a lot of it. But here's the problem. Our muscles only store enough ATP to begin a muscle contraction. Once you begin the muscle contraction, it has to now make ATP to continue, right? Muscles don't have the ability to store a lot, so we're constantly producing ATP to do our muscle contractions. And that's my last comment. More ATP must be generated to sustain that contraction, right? We only have enough ATP to start that muscle contraction. So how do we get ATP? It turns out there's three pathways we're going to look at. The first one we're going to call the creatine phosphate pathway. Then we'll take a look at anaerobic metabolism and then aerobic metabolism. Before I show you the three pathways, let's just take a look at what ATP is. So ATP itself is a high energy compound, right? We use the energy stored in ATP to do work like chemical reactions and things like that. It turns out that most of the high energy compounds in the body, and then we're only talking about ATP, there's others, they are derived from something known as a nucleotide. Right? Hopefully this sounds somewhat familiar to you. A nucleotide, if you recall, is the building blocks of DNA and RNA. And just to review their structure, a nucleotide consists of a 5-carbon sugar. Now, in this case of ATP, it's going to be ribose. Right, this was the same sugar that was in RNA. The nucleotide is also going to have the phosphate group and a nitrogenous base. If you remember, the nitrogenous bases were like adenine, thymine, guanine, cytosine, uracil. The only one we have to know for ATP is adenine. Okay, so ATP is going to have this kind of foundation here, this nucleotide consisting of ribose, a phosphate group, and adenine. Once we have this kind of base, this nucleotide, we're going to add more phosphates. This process is known as phosphorylation. Right? Very simply, it's the chemical reactions of adding a phosphate group to some molecule. Right? So in this case, we're going to be adding the phosphate group to this nucleotide. And these processes of phosphorylation produce these high energy bonds. Let me show you what we're talking about. So this here, red, blue, and the 3 yellow structures, make up one ATP molecule. Notice we have ribose, that's the 5-carbon sugar, adenine, and that's the nitrogenous base. And then here's a phosphate. So if I were to put a circle around right here, just this whole thing, the red, the blue, and the yellow here, just the first yellow, this would be a nucleotide. How do we get the name adenosine? Very simply, we take ribose and combine it with adenine. These two structures, 1 and 2, make up adenosine. Right, this is where we get the term adenosine from. It's just a combination of ribose and adenine. Now, once we add the first phosphate to adenosine, right here, we end up with a structure known as adenosine monophosphate. And that's what they have over here, this line right here up to this point. This would be adenosine monophosphate. We're actually not going to work with this semester in AMP1. In future semesters like AMP2 we talk about this. So just kind of be aware that it exists, but we're not going to really focus on it. Now, if we do phosphorylation and we add another phosphate group to the adenosine monophosphate, which we abbreviate, by the way, AMP, Now we add another phosphate to this phosphate right here. We bring in this by phosphorylation. We now produce a high energy bond, but the structure we have is adenosine, 1, 2. So this would be adenosine diphosphate, where di is 2. And we abbreviate this compound ADP. Add a third phosphate to the ADP, we get another high energy bond right there, that red bond. Now we have 3 phosphates. We have adenosine triphosphate, which very simply is ATP. For the chemical reactions that we're going to be looking at this semester, this is the bond right here that we break. It releases energy to do, again, run chemical reactions and to do work, that type of thing. So I like this picture. It's a nice simplified picture showing the adenosine part here. And then as we add phosphates, 1 monophosphate. Now we have 2 diphosphate. And then we add 1, 2, 3 triphosphate. We're mostly going to look at this semester the interaction or the exchange between ADP becoming ATP and then breaking ATP down to become ADP. We're going to kind of focus between these two. Let me go forward one. So this we actually covered already. So AMP is adenosine with 1 phosphate. ADP is adenosine with 2 phosphates. And then ATP is adenosine with 3 phosphates. There is an enzyme that is necessary to break down ATP into ADP to release that energy. We call this adenosine triphosphatase. Just so you know, whenever you see the suffix ase, it means enzyme. Okay, so adenosine triphosphatase, and this is the enzyme necessary to convert ATP into ADP, and now we release our energy. This is just the same picture, just showing for anybody that likes chemistry, the actual structure. So here's our 5-carbon sugar, what it actually looks like. Here's our adenine. You can see it's a lot of nitrogen, so it's a nitrogenous base. And then here's phosphate group 1, phosphate group 2, phosphate group 3, and again you can always see the high energy bonds. You don't have to know these structures here. I just thought it was an interesting picture. I like this one better. All right, nice and simple. Okay, so a couple moments ago I had mentioned that there were 3 pathways that we want to study for the formation of ATP. The first one we're going to go over is the creatine phosphate pathway, and then we'll do anaerobic respiration, and then we'll do aerobic respiration. So when we're at rest, when we're not really using our muscles that much, believe it or not, we produce more ATP than is needed. Right? So if you're sitting right now listening to this lesson, right, and you're not really doing a lot, you're probably making more ATP than you need because you're just sitting around, right? You're just sitting and learning. So it turns out this extra ATP that we have, we can't store it. What we have to do is take the energy in this last phosphate here, and we're going to transfer it to a protein that's inside of our muscle all the time called creatine, right? You may have actually heard of this. It's a protein that's just naturally made in our muscles. We're going to take the high energy of this phosphate here, transfer it to creatine, and now produce a chemical called creatine phosphate and store that high energy in this molecule. This, the muscle can store. I want you to think of this almost as a savings account, right? If we have extra money, right? ATP is going to be our money, right? I would hope you wouldn't spend your money. You're going to take it to the bank and you're going to save it in your savings account. Well, that's what we're doing here. We have extra money, ATP. We're going to store it as a savings account, creatine phosphate. And then good news, if we need that money back, guess what? We can reconvert creatine phosphate back into ATP. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to go back to this here in a second. This is a picture that I like. It's a simplified picture kind of showing this pathway where on the left hand side here, all of this on the left, this is what's happening in a relaxed muscle. And then on the right, from here over, this is what's happening in a contracting muscle. So right now, I want to focus what's happening on the left because we're kind of introducing this concept. So I just kind of blew this up. Watch this. Let's just say we have at rest, relaxed muscle, more ATP than we need. So what happens is this. The high energy bond, we're going to take this phosphate and we're going to transfer it to creatine. Remember I said this is naturally inside of our muscle. So this is the first time you're probably seeing something like this. This is where you actually see biochemical reactions kind of clashing. We take the energy of ATP, so follow this arrow here, and now it's going to clash with the creatine. That's this arrow here. And we're going to take the phosphate and we're going to transfer it to creatine and now end up over here with creatine phosphate. This is savings account, actually savings account number 1. We're going to learn that there's 2 savings accounts that I want you to know. So now we can save ATP in the form of creatine phosphate. Right? So all we did is we transferred a phosphate to creatine to form creatine phosphate. But when we took the phosphate here off of ATP, what did we end up with is an ADP, right? Because we removed the phosphate. I'm going to go back a minute. What we did was we actually removed this phosphate. If you kind of block this out for a minute, what's left is just 2 phosphates. So we're left with ADP. Okay, and we'll learn in a little bit. This creatine phosphate we can reconvert back to creatine, give up that phosphate. I'll show you here. We can take this creatine phosphate, we can give the phosphate over to ADP and reform ATP, right? So we just kind of, we can cash this in and remake ATP if we need the energy. Okay, so this is a great like savings account, and we do this naturally when we're at rest because we make more ATP than we need. Now there's an enzyme that we need to reform ADP back into ATP. That enzyme is called creatine kinase. When we go here, guys, from the ADP on this side back to ATP by taking the phosphate off of here and putting it onto here, right in here there would be an enzyme called creatine creatine kinase. All right, so this is a good picture just kind of showing how we could take our extra money and what are we going to do? We're going to deposit it in the bank, savings account number 1. And in a couple moments I'll show you how we again cash that in, so we'll get into that in more detail. The second pathway we want to take a look at is the anaerobic metabolism or anaerobic respiration, and we call this glycolysis. The reason they say it's anaerobic is because it does not require oxygen to be present. It will work whether oxygen is there or whether oxygen is not there. It doesn't really matter. This is a process, though, that does not take place in the mitochondria. It actually takes place, I have it down here, in the cytoplasm. All right, so these chemical reactions, there's about 10 steps. We're not going to get into it that detailed, but there's about 10 steps that take place in this cytoplasm. When we rely on this in the muscle is when we do peak muscular activity, right? When you're giving it your all, let's say you're really pushing yourself during a workout or some type of competition, right? You're giving it your 100%. This is where we get ATP to do this peak muscular activity. Now, the fuel that we break down to do glycolysis is actually going to be glucose. We have glucose stored in our muscle in a form known as glycogen. Right? Glycogen is our stored form of glucose. This is actually going to be savings account number 2. I'll show you this in a minute. We can actually cash in savings account number 2 to make glucose. Then we can break down the glucose in the cytoplasm to make some ATP. All right, so glycogen, guys, for now, just know that it's our stored form of glucose. We store it in the muscle, which we're seeing today. One other place, if you're interested, is going to be in the liver. if you were to look at it on, chemically, it's a large branching network of glucose. Looks like just a bunch of branches, a big tree type of thing, branching all over the place, and each branch is just made up of glucoses bonded together. Now, when we break down the glucose by this process known as glycolysis, we end up getting two ATP molecules. So for every glucose, we walk away with two ATP and two chemicals known as pyruvate, right? Two molecules known as pyruvate. So these are the end products of glycolysis. What do you need to know? Right, you need to know this is an anaerobic process. That means it does not require oxygen. Where does it take place? In the cytoplasm. When does the muscle rely on it? During peak muscular activity, not now when you're at rest, right? When you're pushing yourself. What are we burning? Glucose. And what do we walk away with? Two ATP molecules and two pyruvates. Okay, the third pathway is the really the predominant pathway where we get most of our ATP from. This is known as aerobic metabolism. Now, this one does occur in the mitochondria, and they call it aerobic right here. They call it aerobic because we need oxygen. If oxygen is not present, this pathway will not run. Right, so it has to have oxygen available. So this is the primary energy source of resting muscles. Right? It provides about 95% of the ATP. Right, so this is really what we rely on. And like I said, it occurs in the mitochondria. Oxygen has to be present, and then we have to metabolize different organic substances. I put here as an example pyruvate. Watch this, I'm going to go back a minute, which we just saw over here. So we can burn this if it's in the cytoplasm. Also fatty acids, right? Long chain fatty acids. Now in the mitochondria, this is a little bit advanced. There's two pathways that take place. There's something known as the citric acid cycle. Right? You may have learned it or heard of it as the Krebs cycle. It's kind of an older term. They also call it the tricarboxylic acid cycle. Any one of those names are fine. This is a complex pathway which produces a bunch of different, I put here intermediaries. These are like chemicals that we need in this next pathway over here. So we need to have this citric acid cycle to run the next pathway known as the electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation. These are the final steps of aerobic respiration where we walk away with a bunch of ATP, right? A lot more than we saw in anaerobic respiration. So what do we need to know on this slide? Aerobic respiration occurs in the mitochondria and it needs oxygen. Right, there's two pathways, the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation. These are the pathways inside the mitochondria that produce our ATP. So just to kind of give you an idea, this is from our old chapter 3 where we went over the anatomy of the mitochondria. Here's a mitochondria. If we cut into it, see all these membranes that are folded on the inside? These are called cristae, and this is where a lot of the enzymes are to run the chemical reactions that we're talking about. And there's also like a fluid filled here inside the middle between the cristae called the matrix. So you can see here organic molecules go in like the pyruvate or fatty acids plus good old oxygen, right? They go in, they get metabolized, and we produce our ATP. CO2 is a byproduct of actually the Krebs cycle, that type of thing. So this is where the CO2 is coming from. I love this picture too. Here they're actually showing a real mitochondria, right? We have to magnify this. Look at this, 46,000 times to see it. So here too, they're kind of giving just a simplified version of how the mitochondria works. So watch this. If we took pyruvate and put it into the mitochondria, again, as long as oxygen is present, we can go through the citric acid cycle. We could go through the electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation, right? That's this kind of this part over here. And we walk away with ATP, right? We walk away with that's the main thing that we really want, the ATP. We don't really worry about the other stuff. The other thing that we release from the citric acid cycle is the CO2. So you can see here, this is just kind of showing the different reactions that are taking place inside the mitochondria. As an example, burning up the pyruvate, but it could be fatty acids going in here, even amino acids, just different things that we can metabolize for energy. Okay, so just to kind of finish up this aerobic metabolism, and then I'll show you some examples. Skeletal muscles at rest predominantly metabolize fatty acids, and we store glycogen and creatine phosphate. If you just want to add to your notes, this is savings account 1, and glycogen is going to be savings account 2. So while we're resting, we're going to burn fatty acids, but we're going to deposit creatine phosphate for future use, savings account 1, and then glycogen, savings account 2. That's when we're at rest. Once we switch to, say, moderate activity, the muscles are going to generate ATP by breaking down glucose primarily by aerobic respiration. Right? So say you kind of go onto the treadmill, or you're going to go walk outside, do a moderate workout, right? This is what we're going to do. We're going to break down more so glucose as our main fuel. Once you push yourself and you go to peak activity, right, really push yourself, we're then going to switch over to the anaerobic respiration, because more than likely there's not going to be enough oxygen to meet the demands of aerobic respiration. So we switch over to glycolysis, but the problem here is we're going to be making a lot less ATP, and that's one of your reasons when you push yourself, you start to fatigue, right? And you produce this chemical you may have heard of called lactate. Sometimes we commonly call it lactic acid. Right? We're going to talk about that in a minute. So in the PowerPoint here and in your book, I just reorganized it so we can see the picture a little bit better. There are 3 pictures that I'd like you to study, and I'm going to go over with you. We're going to take a look at what's happening in a muscle fiber at rest. And then we'll go to the next slide for a minute. Then we're going to go to the muscle fiber, what's happening with moderate activity. And then we're going to look at what happens in the muscle fiber at peak activity, right, when we push ourselves. So what we're looking at here, guys, is this. This is not a whole muscle. This is one muscle cell, right? One muscle fiber. Right next to it is a capillary that has blood in it. So I'm going to hold off reading the notes over here. Let's just kind of go over what we see. So while we're at rest, like right now, hopefully you're just sitting here, learning this material, or not working out while we're speaking, which is kind of resting. Watch what happens. Fatty acids, which are naturally in the bloodstream, are going to go into the mitochondria, and we can metabolize them right through that Krebs cycle and the oxidative phosphorylation and the electron transport chain, right? We can metabolize them in the mitochondria. But watch this, as long as what's present? Oxygen. Right? The mitochondria will only work if oxygen is present, and this is where we make CO2, and this is what ultimately will go back into the blood, and we breathe that out from our lungs. Right? So this is where we're getting a lot of our ATP. How do I know that? Watch this, guys. Here's the ATP coming out of the mitochondria. Right? So fatty acids going in with oxygen, ATP coming out. But what did we say before? We're probably producing more ATP here than we need. We can't store this ATP. What are we going to do? We're going to take this ATP, take the phosphate, add it to creatine. See how the arrows clash right here? And now we make our creatine phosphate savings account number 1. All right, so we could store this. So we're basically storing energy as creatine phosphate instead of ATP. All right, so here's our savings account 1. At the same time, glucose, right, this is showing a molecule of glucose, is also entering the muscle. But since we're resting, we're not going to burn that. We don't need to burn it. We're burning fatty acids. So what can we do with this glucose? We can store it and convert it into glycogen. This is savings account number 2. Right? So right now, while we're resting, we're putting into our creatine phosphate savings account, and we're putting into our glycogen savings account. Okay, so this is what's happening at rest. We have plenty of ATP to do whatever muscle contractions that we're doing. Right, so that pretty much covers everything that's here, right? The demand for ATP at rest is low. There's sufficient oxygen so that the mitochondria can produce enough ATP to meet the demand. We produce a surplus of ATP actually, so we could actually take this ATP and use it to convert glucose into glycogen. Right, this was my savings account number 2. We can also create creatine phosphate, which is savings account number 1. Now, let's just say you decide that after this lesson's over, you're going to go burn some energy, right? I gave you a lot of information today. Go burn off some stress, and you're going to take a brisk walk, or you're going to run, or something like that. Do a workout. So you're going to go from being resting to moderate activity. So let's read through this first, and then I'll go over the picture here. The demand obviously is going to increase for ATP. So there's still enough oxygen in the mitochondria to meet that demand. But watch this. There's no excess ATP being made. Remember with the resting muscle, we had more than enough ATP. We can convert it to creatine phosphate. So if you notice now, the mitochondria is making ATP, but notice we're not depositing into savings account number 1, right? That's because we don't have enough ATP to do that. What else? So we're burning fatty acids here, just like the previous slide, and we have oxygen going in. So that means the mitochondria is going to work. CO2 comes out. But notice, guys, the glucose that was in the muscle, before we were turning it into glycogen, we're not doing that. This time we're going to take the glycogen and break it down into glucose. And now we're going to burn that glucose through this pathway right over here. This is actually glycolysis. It's like 10 different steps where we have glucose being broken down into 2 pyruvates, and we produce 2 ATP. This is something that happens, like I said before, in the cytoplasm without oxygen being present. And now we can use this pyruvate, metabolize it to produce bigger amounts of ATP. Look at this, like 30 ATP over here. Okay, so we're getting a lot more ATP. So when you work out, you're still going to burn fatty acids. You're now going to break down your glycogen into glucose. The glucose will go through a pathway called glycolysis. We end up with 2 pyruvates. Those can easily go into the mitochondria, again, as long as what's present? Oxygen. And as long as we're getting enough oxygen to the muscle, right? If you're in like good enough condition, right? You're well conditioned. We can get plenty of oxygen to the muscle. The mitochondria will work. And look at this. We'll produce a lot more ATP. And now the myofibrils can use that ATP for contraction. So again, we're also not making CP anymore, nor are we making glycogen, right? We're not depositing into savings account 1 or savings account 2. We're actually cashing in savings account 2. Okay, and you can do this, for like a long run, for an hour of moderate exercise if you want to, as long as you're conditioned enough and you have enough oxygen coming to the muscle, you have enough fatty acids, you have enough glycogen, right? You can keep going for quite some time. Think about someone that runs a marathon, right? They do it for hours. Now, let's just say you're in your workout and you're deciding, you know what, I'm going to do sprints. I'm going to really push myself. I do heavy weights or something like that. So this is going to be now muscle metabolism at peak activity. So this I do want to read for a second because I want to show you what they did over here. The demand for ATP when you push yourself is enormous. The problem is oxygen cannot diffuse into the fiber fast enough for the mitochondria to meet the demand. So the problem, like I'm saying, is there's not enough oxygen getting to the mitochondria. Only 1/3 of a cell's ATP needs can be met by the mitochondria when you do peak activity. Only 1/3, right? Where it needs still another 2/3, but it just can't do it. So I just wanted to show you here the mitochondria are not being shown. It just would confuse the picture. I just want you to know in the background they are working, giving us 1/3 of the ATP, but not enough. The rest of the ATP that means is going to come from glycolysis. So notice, guys, glycogen is being broken down to glucose. The glucose is going to form two pyruvates and we're going to get 2 ATP. This pathway here was glycolysis. This is going to be one of the main ways we get ATP, but we're only getting 2 ATP. That's not going to be a lot to sustain a muscle contraction, and that's one of the reasons when you push yourself, your muscles then get tired, they fatigue. The other place we can get some more ATP is savings account number 1, right? So we were cashing in savings account number 2 over here. Now we're going to cash in savings account number 1 right there. How do we do that? We're going to take the phosphate from creatine phosphate, add it to ADP, and now we're going to form ATP and we'll have creatine left over. And now we can use some of this ATP for muscle contraction. Again, maybe this gives us an extra 15, 20 seconds of muscle contraction. It's not a lot. And again, we burn this up really quick. So between not having much ATP from glycolysis, not having much ATP from creatine phosphate, again, your muscles fatigue, right? They actually fatigue. Here's another problem. Since there's not enough oxygen to make the mitochondria run, pyruvate can't get into the mitochondria. I'm going to go back a slide for a minute. Remember before, pyruvate, as long as oxygen was present, can go into the mitochondria and produce like 30 ATP. In this scenario here, the pyruvate can't get into the mitochondria because there's not enough oxygen. This starts to build up. This is kind of a, it's a strong acid, believe it or not. The body doesn't want this, the muscle doesn't want this in it. So watch what happens. There's a chemical reaction that converts the pyruvate into what you may have heard as lactic acid. Lactic acid, right? We call it lactate. So this builds up in the muscle. What this does is this actually diffuses into the bloodstream, and I'll show you this on the next few slides. This lactate will go to the liver, and the liver reconverts it to glucose, and we can reuse it. So we actually recycle this. This is the stuff sometimes that makes you sore after a heavy workout, right? Your muscles are sore. This is the lactate. All right, so during peak muscle activity, we're cashing in both savings account, creatine phosphate and glycogen, and we're not getting a lot of ATP. So this is one of the reasons, again, we get rapid fatigue, right? We also build up lactic acid, which makes the environment more acidic. Okay, so I do want you to study, I'll go back for a minute, the 3 slides: resting muscle fiber, what's happening, moderate activity, and peak activity. Okay, so after we exercise, there is a period of time known as the recovery period. Very simply, this is the time required after the exertion, right after your exercise, for the muscles to return back to normal, right? Get rid of the lactic acid, build up glycogen again, build up our creatine phosphate, just to kind of get back to normal. As I mentioned before, that lactate will go into the bloodstream. So it diffuses from your muscle into the bloodstream, and in the liver it gets transformed back to glucose. That process is known as the Cori cycle. Right? It's this chemical reactions. It's a pathway where we convert the lactate back into glucose. Right? So the lactate is transferred from the muscle to the liver. The liver converts the lactate to pyruvate, and then the pyruvate gets converted back to glucose. Now we can reuse this glucose, right? We can send it back to the muscles and rebuild glycogen. Remember we said that glucose, I take it back. Remember we said that glycogen is our stored form of glucose, right? So we can take this glucose and reconvert it to glycogen. One other thing you probably notice or remember after you work out or maybe you run a race, sometimes people will bend over and they'll breathe really deep, long, deep breaths for a while. This is because we use up so much oxygen when we do that type of exercise that we actually go into oxygen debt, right? We actually used up so much that we don't have enough. So we call this oxygen debt. It's also known as post exercise oxygen consumption. Very simply, after exercise or other some other exertion, the body needs more oxygen than usual to get things back to normal. So that causes us to breathe faster and deeper. So if you think about it, if you do like a light workout, right, your oxygen debt is not that much, right? You may not breathe that heavy for that long a period of time, opposed to if you did like a really hard, intense workout, your oxygen debt may be greater, right? You would breathe faster and deeper for a longer period of time. Just a couple other things about muscles too and energy. We kind of know this that when you work out, you get hot, right? The reason for that is that active skeletal muscles produce heat. So we release up to 85% of the heat needed to maintain normal body temperature, right? So just part of the normal metabolism, our skeletal muscles will burn up, will release heat. And then the last slide for this lesson is we do have some hormones. These are hormones you do talk more about in detail in anatomy and physiology too, that help to control muscle metabolism. They would be growth hormone, right? We'll learn that's produced by a gland called the pituitary gland, testosterone, thyroid hormones, and epinephrine. These are hormones that actually increase the metabolic activity of the skeletal muscles, right? So you kind of release these when you are doing your exercise. Okay, so that concludes this lesson on how we produce energy in the muscles. Again, without these pathways, we would never have enough ATP to do our normal muscle contractions.